Okay, so like I said, I want us to move together to the page of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Um, and if you read this document, and I know a lot of you are IR students and law students, and so I assume many of you have already actually taken a look at the Universal Declaration before. Um, and if you read it again with new eyes, you'll see that it's declared by the United Nations General Assembly on 10 December 1948. And the very way that it's written is in a kind of Kantian spirit. Just as, like I said, the European Union can be seen as a vision of what the Federation of Peace that Kant thought would ultimately become a global phenomenon, um, what that Federation of Peace might look like. The Universal Declaration, in some ways, envisions Kant's idea of where our human learning from history would ultimately take us. And the preamble is written in terms of essentially learning from history, learning from the horrendous realities of the Second World War. So it says, uh, the preamble, whereas recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. Whereas disregard and contempt for human rights have resulted in barbarous acts which have outraged the conscience of mankind, right? Uh, we've seen as all members of the world, of the nations of the world, as humanity, what happens when we don't think about rights in fully human and universal terms. So we've come together as humanity, as all the nations of the world, to say that these are the rights that belong to all of us simply by virtue of being human beings, right? So, uh, we're not going to go through all of them. You can take a moment, stop the video, and actually read the 30 articles for yourself. If you haven't had a chance to do so already, I would suggest doing it again, even if you have. Um, and part of what we're going to do is we're going to try to compare the Universal Declaration to the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen that we've looked at together in this class already. In some ways, this is a document that has one of its at least inspirations in the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. And many of its articles are very much comparable to that other article. But the really fundamental thing you see in the first five articles, the first article says, we're all human beings, we're born free and equal in dignity and rights. Um, and those first five articles are there to define what it means to be human, to be equal, and to honor the dignity of human beings. And more than anything, Article 2, the universality and equality, again, comes from this idea that we have these rights regardless of who we are, in what society we're in. As it says, uh, everyone is entitled to these rights without distinction of any kind, such as race, color, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth, or other status. Meaning, if you were a person completely on your own outside of any society as a human being, you still fundamentally, simply by being human, have these rights. Um, so these are not rights that come from belonging to a culture or to a community of any kind. They're rights that define and come from our humanity. And one way in which we can talk about uh, where these rights differ from the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, and this is where I had that last slide, um, is that they include not only what lawyers refer to as negative rights, um, these are rights that every individual has that cannot be taken away from you, right? Uh, like Article 18. Um, Everyone has a right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion, including the right to change your religion and belief. Article 19. Everyone has a right to freedom of opinion and expression. Everyone has the right, number 20, to peaceful assembly and association. Um, this means that regardless of what anybody in society does, these are rights that we have that nobody can take away from us. Aside from these negative rights, the Universal Declaration also includes a group of now positive rights, um, which uh, you see certainly from Article 22 forward, um, which say everyone as a member of society has a right to social security and is entitled to realization through national effort and international cooperation, and in accordance with the organization and resources of each state, of the economic, social, and cultural rights indispensable for his dignity and the free development of his personality. So you have the right not only to your security of person and the security of the laws, you have the right to a social security, um, meaning uh, a security as kind of a basic standard of life. And then those are spelled out in number 23, for example. Um, it means you have the freedom to work, and not only that, to equal right for equal work, and to protection against unemployment. Um, Number 24, everybody has the right to vacations. Everybody has a right to holidays with pay. Number 25 defines essentially a right to healthcare and to a basic standard of life. Number 26 is a basic right to education. Um, these are called positive rights because the idea is that we all actually in a society have to do something to make sure that others actually enjoy these rights. So they're not simply negative rights and that they're just rights that can't be taken away from me. It's that I have to do something. I have to presumably give away from my property so that everybody can have education, everybody can have health care. So you see that the notion of universal human rights came to be increasingly extended um, in the era of after the Second World War. And you can go through these rights and you can think for yourself, do you agree that these are rights that we all fundamentally have as human beings, if you believe that rights are defined actually fundamentally by our humanity and they are universal in that sense. Um, Now, we want to talk about some of the quandaries about this idea of universal human rights because that's obviously what Arendt is going to be talking about. Um, and the quandaries have to do with some of the historical problems with this idea of universal human rights, which will then help us once we start talking about the relationship between identity and rights. So I'm going to go back to um, the slide. Oh, this is the wrong. Okay. All right. So one problem is how universal are human rights? when we say that there are universal human rights, we're essentially saying that it doesn't matter, like as we talked about, it doesn't matter what community you belong to, it doesn't matter what culture you are a part of. Simply by being human, you're supposed to have all of these rights. So, if you believe in the idea of universal human rights, you're essentially saying that there are no such things as specific cultural rights that might impinge on what would be rights that belong to all human beings. Um, if we all have the right of security of person and our bodies, then it doesn't matter that in some cultures, for example, um, some people may be forced to undergo certain violence against their bodies, like genital mutilation, as it's called, in certain societies, where when you come of age, you're supposed to go through these rituals, which are, as far as universal human rights would be concerned, a kind of violence against your body. Um, if you believe in the idea of universal human rights, and you can't say, well, these people in their culture, this is the customs that they have, and we can't question that because that's their culture. No, they have the same rights not to experience that kind of violence as any other human being. So the question is, how universal are these rights that we have? And is there a problem then, if you believe in them, with the idea that what we might be contravening on cultural practices um, that are different in different areas of the world that may go against what we consider somehow to be universal and human. And then how much right do we have to go and to tell those people, listen, you have to change your culture because you're going against fundamental human rights? And this is the moment in which we get into a fundamental problem with the idea of human rights, which is that this ideal, right, thinking in universal human terms about rights, itself comes from a certain cultural context. It comes from the modern European and Western world. And this is why many people, when they criticize the idea of universal human rights and say, this is not as universal as people claim, they do it by saying, actually, this way of thinking about rights does not honor the cultural diversity around the world and the right of different groups of people to practice their own ideals, their own visions of what their societies should or should not be. And they point to the fact that this ideal of universality was actually used to justify European imperialism in the 19th and 20th century, and some argue to this very day, essentially. Um, so let me give you an example of that. Remember how Sieyès argued about how, well, um, we believe in the rights of man as defining citizenship, but women, it's okay if we don't quite include them, or anybody who doesn't have enough property, if we don't allow them actually to have the full kind of citizenship of being able to have the freedom to decide for others and to be chosen as people who decide for others. Why? Because they themselves don't think in universal terms, right? Because they don't think in human terms, because they're dependent, because they're immature, um, then we actually can take away uh, the full capacity for citizenship and freedom that we allow for people who do think in universal terms. Well, that's exactly how imperialists who went all around the world and claimed that what they were doing was bringing universal human rights all around the world. That's essentially how they argued. They said, we're coming here because these people are not fully civilized. they're still caught in the midst of all kinds of barbaric customs and practices that don't realize the full universality of humanity and its rights. And this gives us the right to come here uh, to help them actually become full human beings and to protect all of those people who are being subjected to those cultural practices which are inhuman, right? So the British, for example, when they went to India, one of the ways that they tried to justify their rule was to talk about the practice of sati, right? The practice of sati in India. This was a practice which is not necessarily a part of um, Hindu religious practices more generally, but it was a cultural practice that involved widows uh, burning themselves on the funeral pyre of their dead husbands. Um, it was an ideal of wifely devotion, right? I love my husband so much that I kill myself with him to show how much I actually care for my husband. You know that in India, in Hindu practice, bodies are cremated. And you have a cartoon here, a British cartoon of this practice. Uh, and this was an ideal of wifely devotion, but as you can imagine, no family wants to have a wife who is not devoted to their husband. And there were all kinds of material considerations of property, etc., that in many cases where sati actually was practiced, made it a coercive, made it a custom in which the woman was essentially forced to burn herself. And when the British went to India, they essentially argued, why are we here? We're here to stop these kinds of barbaric practices. We're here to rescue women who are human beings as much as anybody else in the world from being subjected to these kinds of practices. And so, um, after a period, um, essentially the British started banning this practice in some of the areas that they ruled. And this was the way in which they described um, and justified their imperial rule in India in terms of bringing civilization to India and bringing humanity and rights to India. Um, and this is, again, an ongoing problem because so many people believe in this idea of universal human rights. But the question then is, um, how universal are they? To what extent can we actually infringe on the cultural practices of different people in the world in the name of universal human rights? And this brings up the other problem, which is a fundamental problem, which is if we believe in the idea of universal human rights, then how do we actually make them real? If you read the Universal Declaration, there's, this these 30 rights, these article of 30 articles defining our humanity and our human rights sound very grand. And they're couched in such a way that it's almost impossible for people to say, why would you disagree with this? How could you say that this is a bad idea? It, in a way, defines that society of perpetual peace that Kant was hoping for. But then the problem becomes if you believe in this idea, you have to look around our world and say, well, um, it all sounds really good, but how do we actually practice these rights? How would we make them real? And that brings up the same problem that we were talking about when we also talked about their universality. If they're not fully universal as yet in the way that they're practiced, um, how are they supposed to become real? How do we overcome the problem that they can simply be used essentially to justify imperial incursion or wars, right? In the Iraq War, the United States went into Iraq in 2003. First, the reasoning being to find weapons of mass destruction. But then, when that wasn't found, the argument became that we're here essentially to liberate the Iraqi people from the dictatorship of Saddam Hussein. Another example of human rights as justifying in one society going into another society and transforming it in one way or another. But if you see human rights being violated somewhere around the world, and you believe in them, don't you have an obligation? How do you actually think about how human, if you believe in them? This is a fundamental problem. One problem is how universal are they? And another problem is if we believe in human rights, how do we actually make them real? Well, uh, I want to argue too that in some sense, Kant had one of the answers to this idea. Um, and this idea was, well, it's precisely our human development over time that will make us more and more human. It will make us think increasingly in universal terms about rights. And so it will create the right goalposts essentially for us to know who we want to become and what we want to achieve. So if you look at those rights, those 30 articles, you might say, well, uh, these don't seem that real for so many people. But if you're looking at it from Kant's perspective, you could go back 500 years and you would say none of those rights were real anywhere in the world. But if we look today, they are the basis of many societies around the world, certainly in the European Union, for example. And so they are exercised and real, and they're the goalposts for certainly so many other societies around the world. So even though one could be cynical about how these ideals are used, I'll give you an example. The United States, every year, the State Department in the United States does a human rights report on countries all over the world. And as you can imagine, certain countries like China and North Korea and Russia have these very long dossiers of their human rights violations. Um, eh, and we could see this in this kind of imperialistic way. But over the last few years, China has now started to do a human rights report on the US. And again, you could see this in a kind of, and there are a lot of, in terms of, the US has per capita the largest prison population, the number of people that die from gun violence, in the US. There are all kinds of human rights worries in the US. And on the one hand, you could be cynical and say, look, this is just made into a political tool, just as it was in the era of imperialism. But on the other hand, you'd have to say, no, look, this has become the way in which everybody around the world increasingly is talking about rights. When I teach this class and I talk to students from all over the world at IE, it's amazing the number of people who say that they believe in the idea of universal human rights. And so for Kant, this just shows you that we're moving towards a world in which increasingly people think in universal and human terms about rights. And that is actually then the goal ultimately of our development. And that's what our development will ultimately allow us to achieve. And I have here, you see a website from Hans Rosling. This is a 4 minute small little video on the BBC called 200 Countries in 4 Minutes or 200 Countries in 200 Years. Um, and you can stop this now and you can go and look at this video. And it's essentially a story, the Kantian story of the progress and the development that we have had over the last 200 years. Um, Arguing that we are moving, we are fundamentally developing in wealth, in our standard of living, certainly in literacy. When Kant was writing, there was less than 15% literacy all around the world. Now we're moving increasingly almost towards 90% literacy around the world. And that means that that's happened not just in the developing areas of the world, which are at 99% and above, but it's happening all around the world, actually, including in the developing areas of the world. And so this is part of the story of, again, looking at that society of innovation and of progress, this society based on the idea of universal human rights, and looking at our world as a world which is actually moving towards that reality. Okay? Um, so I hope you've actually watched that video. And now we want to start to move towards talking about um, the relationship between this idea of universal human rights, how it was supposed to become real, um, and what is the problem that Arendt actually has with it. What Arendt is doing in the text that you're reading, that you've read from her, is essentially talking about. I talked about just now about the Kantian vision of development and human rights, but Arendt is talking about the fundamental way in which actually human rights were supposed to become a reality for everybody in the world. And we can get a good sense of that by comparing the Universal Declaration of Human Rights with the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. Um, so I'm going to do that. I'm going to go to this website. And we've already gone through this together over a couple of weeks ago, essentially. Um, so look at this and compare it to the Universal Declaration. Uh, you can take a moment, stop the video, read this again. If you look at it, the biggest difference probably that you'll see, and I talked about the difference between positive and negative rights, and you'll see uh, this is a document fundamentally mostly about negative rights, except for the obligations that you have, obviously, not only to pay taxes, but to be willing to die for your country. But the fundamental difference that you'll see is that while the Universal Declaration is a kind of moral vision of our humanity and our human dignity, a declaration by all of the nations of the world of what they take our humanity and our dignity to consist of, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen is fundamentally about citizenship. So, uh, if you read through it, you'll see that it's all fundamentally about the law. Uh, Not only does it say in number 3, the principle of all sovereignty resides essentially in the nation, um, starting from 4 and going to 11, every right that it prescribes, it couches in terms of the law. So, number 4, where it says, liberty means that you can do whatever it is that you want as long as you don't step on the rights of others. So, the limits of your rights, of your freedom, can only be determined by law. 5, law can only prohibit such actions as are hurtful to society. 6, law is the expression of the general will. 7, uh, you can't be accused of any crime except if it has already been legally defined. Um, if you're to be arrested, it has to be done through uh, um, a lawful decree. Um, and number 8, uh, you have to be punished only according, again, to legally defined punishments. Um, Number nine, you're free and innocent. You're innocent until you're proven guilty. If you have to be arrested, uh, all harshness not essential to the securing of the prisoner's person shall be severely repressed by law. 10. You have the right of freedom of opinion and of your religious views, but provided they do not disturb the public order established by law. Uh, 11. You have the right to freely communicate your ideas and opinions, but you shall be responsible for such abuses of this freedom as shall be defined by law, right? So this is actually all about not the rights that you have as a human being, the rights of man, are used to define citizenship, right? And uh, I'll stop the video here, because now we're gonna move. Basically, this is the way in which human rights were supposed to become real fundamentally for everybody in the world. And this is what we've talked about, right? Um, how was uh, nationality and national citizenship defined? It was defined fundamentally through our human freedom. This is what Rousseau says. Uh, it's fundamentally our human freedom that is defined through our belonging to a nation, to our being part of a collective will that creates and recognizes rights. Um, and it's on that basis, on the basis of that human freedom, that then we all fundamentally have the right to rule ourselves. And so sovereignty, national sovereignty, and citizenship is defined through our human rights. And this is then how ultimately rights are supposed to become real for everybody in the world. So I'm going to stop here, and then I'm going to come back and talk about uh, the relationship then between national identity and rights, the shift that they presumed in the nature of identity and rights, and then what happens to this idea of national identity as based on human rights over the course of the 19th century and into the First and the Second World War. And this is what Arendt is focused on. She's focused on this idea of how human rights were supposed to become real. They were supposed to be the basis of national citizenship. That's how they were supposed to become real for everybody. So, what goes wrong with that story? Why do we end up with genocides? Why do we end up with totalitarianism? And what does that experience of genocide and totalitarianism tell us about the idea of universal human rights? Okay, I stop here and I'll come back.